And then today, I'm so excited to talk about the defense. This is where we're going today, chapter 22. We're kind of like in the middle of this cliffhanger that Luke left off last week. We're in the middle of Paul being arrested and beaten, and now he's going to have a chance to speak, and we're going to get to see what he says today and really unpack that. I was thinking about the American justice system. In 1991, a Texas man was accused of arson that killed his 3 children. So think about how devastating that was. Despite evidence that supported his innocence, including scientific backing to the fire being accidental, as well as many witnesses that verified his innocence, credible witnesses that verified his innocence, and even verified the love that he had for his children, many came to this man's defense. Despite all that, he was eventually convicted, and then in 2004, he was executed. Now, that's tragic. I know, we're starting on a down. We're going to get it up. Don't worry. But that was sad. That was devastating. Injustice does tend to happen in our legal system. We know that. We're not naive to that. We've seen it. We know of many examples for, the life, the history of our country, okay? Injustice does happen in our legal system. But spiritually speaking, this is where we're going today. We have no defense in the face of a holy God, apart from that God becoming our defender, which, as we will talk about today, he became that very thing. He became our defender. Let me get us going with this quote by John Owen. He said, "Our advocate," capital A, that's Jesus. He's talking about Jesus. "Our advocate does not plead that we are innocent. No, but that his righteousness covers us." Here's the big idea today. We have no defense when it comes to our sin, but thanks be to God that he is our literal defense. So I want us to think about as we dive into this passage today. Man, it's going to unpack a lot. But I want us to have the imagery in our minds of some of the verbiage of the psalmists. Some of that verbiage that tells us that God is our rock. God is our fortress. God is our defender. God is the horn of our salvation, which means he's our protector. I want you to think about that as we navigate our way through this passage today. Let's pray, and then we're going to really get moving. God, thank you so much for just the opportunity to gather today and to make much of a God that is so above us, so high and holy, so perfect and spotless and blameless and righteous, so magnificent, so majestic, so glorious. That is you, God. And we want to declare that about you, but at the same time, you are personal. You, in fact, are here among us. You're within us, those that you have saved, God. You're here. Your presence is here. Thank you for that, God. Thank you for how glorious you are, but at the same time, how personal you are. God, would you meet us where we are today? And would you challenge us and change us and comfort us and convict us and conform us into the image of your Son today? Help us now as we walk through this passage. Pray these things in the name of Jesus. Amen. So again, our main idea is this. We have no defense. None. Okay, we're going to unpack this. We have no defense when it comes to our sin. But thanks be to God that he is our literal defense. So let's talk about this first. That we have got to realize that we are the perpetrators. And I've been giving this a lot of thought over the past week as I've been preparing to preach. Realizing that we are the problem. All right, and really realizing that I am the problem and not the victim is the greatest battle. All right. And I've been thinking about this example. I've been praying about a lot of things over the last few years. One thing in particular is just that God would rid our home, the prophet home, okay, our home, of this critical spirit that we have. We're prone to be critical in our home. And we all hate it, all right? We all hate it. But I've been praying against it. But in many ways, it was a very general prayer for years. God, just that critical spirit. And in many ways, what I had in mind were other people in the home, all right? If I'm going to be honest with you, all right, I was thinking about other people in the home. And then God, about a year and a half ago, all right, I even have the date. It was sometime in July of 2024, all right, so not even, just a little over a year ago. I was praying, and he just met me there and said, Aaron, great prayer, but you got to look in the mirror, buddy. Didn't say that exactly, but that's how I kind of received it, all right? And from that moment on, my prayer changed. God, rid me of the critical spirit that is within me. And as you do that, God, would you rid our home of that critical spirit, all right? Sometimes the greatest battle is getting to the place where we realize that we are, in fact, the perpetrators and not necessarily the victims. There will be moments where we're victims. I don't want to dismiss that or downplay that. We're going to walk through life, and at times we will be the victims. We will be sinned against. In a world full of sin, we will be sinned against. But let's not miss the fact that we actually are sinning against others as well. And more importantly, more profoundly, that we have sinned against a holy God. That is step number one. That's what we see Paul do here, okay? So let's catch ourselves up in the narrative here. Paul's time in Jerusalem has really lived up to the hype, right? Like God came to Paul in chapter 19 through the Spirit and said, Paul, you're going to go to Jerusalem. You need to get to Jerusalem, and when you get there, you're going to suffer. And it took him a year to get to Jerusalem, but he's finally there, and guess what? The suffering that was promised came. It came. He has suffered. That's what we looked at last week. After a brief but encouraging touch point with the elders at the Jerusalem church, the entire city of Jerusalem stirred up accusations against Paul. They seized him. They dragged him out of the temple in this big dramatic scene, and then they end up beating him. And the only thing that saved him that we looked at last week was that a Roman tribune intervened. And then soldiers arrested Paul just to save his life. So that's kind of where we were at the end of 21. And then at that point, Paul asks to speak. This is his chance to provide a defense. What will he say? What would you say at this point? I mean, injustice has been done against him. Great injustice has been done against him. So, you would think that what I'm prone to do is to stand up and say, hey, listen, everybody, I've done nothing wrong. What is your problem? What are you doing? Like, this is all unjust. This is an act of injustice, and I'm going to put my foot down, and how dare you do this to me? And I'm going to appeal to all the justice around me that makes sure that this gets rectified now. He doesn't do that. He doesn't do that. In verse 1, we see that he begins by appealing to his family ties. So he starts this way, brothers and fathers. So what does Paul do here? It's very strategic. He finds common ground and he contextualizes with his audience. Paul was very good at this. In fact, we see him say in 1 Corinthians chapter 9 that I have become all things to all men so that by all means some will be saved. Paul thought about every context that he was in. Right now he's in a Jewish context. This is easy for him, all right? He's also in a Roman context, all right? He'll appeal to that in just a moment. But he knows he's got a primarily Jewish audience, and they want him dead, all right? So he appeals to the fact that, hey, I'm one of you. And he'll unpack that more as we go. But he starts with this, brothers and fathers. And then he urges them to hear his defense. And as he speaks in their language, Luke tells us, the Hebrew language, what Luke tells us in verse 2 is that the crowd, who was already quiet, the crowd had already been silenced. We looked at that last week. They grow even quieter here in verse 2. They know now that he is a racial Jew. But in fact, they're wondering still, maybe they are. He reinforces it in verse 3. I am a Jew. He knows that this is going to carry so much weight. He was also a Roman citizen from Tarsus, and that will prove very useful in just a moment. But right now, what he's doing with his captive audience is he wants to emphasize his Jewish roots. So this is what he says in verse 3 as he continues. I was brought up in this city. He's speaking about Jerusalem, all right, the capital city. Educated by this guy, this man named Gamaliel, who would have been a rabbi, who would have been one of the greatest teachers of that time, all right? So Paul was able to be mentored, apprenticed by this man Gamaliel, according to the strict manner of the law. And then he goes on to say this, zealous for God as all of you are. I think he's kind of trolling them here a little bit, all right? but also he understands, he remembers, he can empathize with them. I used to be as crazy and religious as you guys are. His heart is broken over this. We know that. We will see that in many of his writings even. He's broken over the fact that many of his Jewish brethren have rejected God. But he recognizes, hey, you guys are really zealous, okay? But it's kind of misdirected. So this is sort of a diss, all right? But notice also how he highlights not just his Jewish identity. That's important. But also his Pharisaical pedigree. All right, I was thinking about this. I'm from Southern California, all right? I was there for 23 years, the first 23 years of my life. And then God moved me out of Southern California in 2001 to Virginia. Now, California is very different from Virginia. All the Virginians that I would meet, when they would find out that I was from Southern California, what do you think they would ask me? Are you a surfer? Yes. Are you a surfer? And I'm just going to let everybody know in the room, I am not a surfer. I have surfed. I don't like it. I don't like the Pacific Ocean. The Pacific Ocean is cold, even in the middle of the summer. Everybody has to wear a wetsuit. Have you ever tried to put on a wetsuit? It's impossible, all right? It's impossible. There were many practical reasons why I did not want to surf. Also, sharks. That reason too, okay? But everybody would always ask me when I moved to Virginia, and then even when I've moved to Florida, okay, in 2009, hey, are you a surfer? So I guess to be a Californian of Californians, you have to be a surfer, all right? What Paul is doing here is saying, I am a Jew of Jews. Everybody would have known who Gamaliel was. He was trained by this rabbi, this teacher, all right? He knows what he's talking about, okay? So again, captive audience. This is a masterful defense so far by Paul, but he keeps going. You would think that maybe he would just stop there and see what they say and kind of move on. No, keeps going because he's on a mission here. This is what he says in verse 4. I persecuted this way to the death. They would have known what he said. This was their language. This was the language of the non-believers, the non-Christians, even the Jews who hadn't converted. This was the language of the pagans of that time. They called early Christianity, the early church, the way. So he uses their language. Again, he's finding common ground. He's contextualizing. He wants to make sure that he's clarifying, that they know exactly what he's talking about. I persecuted this way to the death, binding and delivering to prison both men and women. This is what Paul did. He is reminding us of his roots, all of his roots. Not just his Pharisaical roots, but the fact that he hurt those that were of this way. Now, the mob would have absolutely loved this particular piece. He even had reputable witnesses. He tells us in verse 5, the high priest and the whole council of elders. His zealousness would eventually lead him to Damascus, or at least on the road to Damascus, to find and imprison more believers. And while the crowd would revel in this whole part of Paul's defense, Paul was setting the tone. Paul was laying the groundwork. He was not trying, some maybe on the surface would think that he's trying to exonerate himself, to gain an audience. In many ways, he is gaining an audience, but he's going to quickly make a shift here. What he is doing here is not exonerating himself, he is condemning himself. He knows, Paul knows, remember, he's the one that would write later on, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. He knew that this was a condemnation on himself and that he had, at the end of the day, no defense before God. That he was, in fact, a perpetrator, guilty of rejecting the one true, holy, perfect, righteous God. The one that all of these Jews thought that they were being zealous about, but that they did not know. They did not know this holy God. Paul would later call himself to Timothy the chief of sinners. What a posturing, by the way. How much humility is seen in that. The fact that we've got to get to a place in our lives, spiritually speaking, where the problem isn't the world or all those around us. Yes, that's part of the problem, all right? But I've got to get real personal about this. I'm the problem. When it comes to just God and me, I don't have a defense. And so that is my first step in my defense, realizing that I have no defense. All right? We bring nothing worthy of a defense to the table. Martin Luther said this: the recognition of sin is the beginning of salvation. And whether or not you fully agree with that theologically, I think that's a good place to be in. Because if we don't recognize and realize that we are a sinner, that we have sinned, that we have rejected a holy God, even if we've offended the law in one way, we're guilty of offending the entire thing, James tells us. So if we don't see that we are sinners, we will not see our need for a Savior. And therefore, we either think that we can save ourselves through our good deeds, right? Or whatever other garden variety religious thought we want to have about that. But it's a good first step to know that we have no defense. So let's move on to this second sub-thought. That what is required if we have no defense is a divine interruption. And I'll ask you this: what is the greatest interrupter in our lives today? Some of you may say your spouse. No, that's not true. Some of you may say your kids. No. Some of you may say work. What is our greatest interrupter in our lives today? It's not busyness. I shudder by holding it. It's this. It's this. It's the phone. All right? Once our phones interrupt us, it takes us about, on average, 23 minutes to dial back in. Because of how much we use our phones, we are 40% less productive. So this is a very bad interrupter. Now, in regards to what we're talking about today, because of our sin, because we are dead in our trespasses and sins, which is what Paul says to the church in Ephesus, we need a divine interruption. If we have no defense, then what is our hope? That God would interrupt our lives. And this is what Paul is going to present. And he does it by giving his testimony. And we're going to see again Paul share his conversion on the road to Damascus. And my hope is that we will continue to see that Paul is like a broken record. We have heard his testimony so many times already. We will continue to hear it as we move forward in the book of Acts. He wants to make sure that his story is known. It's a good rubric for us. It's a good standard for us. Don't stop telling your story. Some of us don't know how to evangelize or what the first step in evangelism is. How do I share my faith? Share your story. Share what God has done in you to save you, to bring you out of sin, to bring you out of hell, to bring you out of the wrath of God, and to connect you to all things related to Him. Forgiveness, redemption, grace and mercy, and His loving kindness. Just share your story. That's what Paul does as he continues to address this crowd. He says in verse 6, "A great light from heaven suddenly shone around me." Again, we know all this. Right? We've talked about this so much since chapter 9. He will later recount again in verse 11 that this light temporarily blinds him. And what happened after this? Well, he fell to the ground and he heard a voice. Verse 7, "Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?" When he asked, "Who are you, Lord?" I love that that's how he asked it, by the way. He knew who he was talking to. He knew who had interrupted him. He knew that this was the Messiah. He knew that this was the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. He knew that this was the Son of God. But the answer came in verse 8. "I am Jesus of Nazareth, whom you are persecuting." I love that he adds the Nazareth, especially to this Jewish crowd, all right, that they know their Messiah. And this, again, fulfilled the prophets of old. This was the guy. This was the Messiah. This was the long-awaited one. Paul is introducing them, if they haven't been introduced to him yet, to Jesus of Nazareth, the eternal God, by the way. And I love Paul's immediate response in verse 10. "What shall I do, Lord?" What a beautiful thought that when God, a holy God, a righteous God, interrupts our lives, which, by the way, He interrupts our lives all the time. with the grace and the beauty around us, as we look at creation, as we open up our Bibles, as we stop to pray, as we talk to others and they're telling us about God. God is constantly interrupting our lives. And the hope, the goal, the aim, the objective would be this, that as this holy God continues to interrupt us, and how beautiful is that, by the way? In this fallen world, these fallen lives, this sinful world, that he would choose to interrupt our lives, that he would choose to break in and wake us up. And the hope and the goal and the objective and the aim would be that as he does that, we would respond in kind with this: what shall I do, Lord? From that moment on, his life was completely redirected. He was no longer on a self-exalting, quasi-religious quest. He was on God's quest. God was the objective now. See, sometimes we get so inundated with even things like religiosity. It becomes all about checking the boxes. Or in our lives, we put other things in that place, the things that we're idolizing, the things that we're chasing after, the things that we're running after. We make those things our object. Paul had made his object a system of religion. He had missed the whole God behind that system of religion. Now he was introduced by that God, this God that he was completely blind to. Now his eyes were open to see that there is a God behind all that. A good God, a loving God, a God that doesn't put demands on you, a God that went to a cross and died for his sin. This is what Paul recognizes, realizes, and now his quest is God's quest for him. His whole life has been turned upside down. God was the object now. So what happened? Well, Jesus first sent him to Damascus to meet a brother named Ananias, who restored his sight. And then what Ananias does is confirm who Paul had encountered. In verse 14, we see that, and Paul's quoting Ananias here, that Ananias had called Jesus of Nazareth the righteous one. And the usage of Old Testament language in quoting Ananias was intentional to reveal how Jesus was their long-awaited Messiah. He's making it so clear. He's connecting so many dots for them. Would they hear? Would they receive? Would they have ears to hear and hearts to be open? Would they? Would they listen? Well, we'll find out. Then came his mission in verse 15. You will be a witness for him to everyone of what you have seen and heard. And then the commission, rise and be baptized and wash away your sin, calling on his name. This is what happened to Paul. This is all it takes. God interrupts our lives. God tells us to get up out of our sinful stupor. He tells us that we're forgiven. And he says, now go live out your objective. And your objective is me. Your objective is my glory. This just simplifies it for us, guys. We're chasing after so many things. We are just like Paul. Paul is no different than us. The same objective that Paul has is the objective that we have in our lives. We exist for the glory of God, to worship him, to live for him, to honor him. Whatever he puts in front of us, we filter that through his glory. It really does simplify things. My marriage, my parenting, my roommates, my education, my job, all of it. I filter it through the glory of God. If I exist for his glory, then everything that I do, everything that I'm participating in is for him and for his glory and for others' good. It really does simplify things. So this is what happened to Paul. He went from perpetrator to pursued by Christ to pursuer of Christ due to this divine interruption. When God breaks into our lives, there is drastic change. We stop going one way and we start going his way. Love what John Owen said about this. I am certain, he said, that nothing but the almighty power of God can break the heart of man, and nothing less than the effectual grace of God can turn it unto himself. May God do that with all of us. May he break in and interrupt us. We need to be interrupted by him. May he do that by his grace through the faith that he gives us to see that. Finally, as we get to our last kind of sub-thought here, we ready ourselves for pressure. I was thinking about the old Ford slogan. It came around the time I was born. And do you remember it? Built, Ford, tough. Thank you. There's about 2 people that are my age or older in here this morning. But that is the slogan that I grew up on. It is a slogan, by the way, though, that's been around pretty much ever since. And then they decided to change it last month. I couldn't believe it when I was doing this research. Guess what the new Ford slogan is? You ready for this? Ready, set, Ford. Not as cool. Not as cool. The marketing guy, he needs to go back to the drawing board on that one, all right? I just love that slogan, built for tough, because when I think about our lives in Christ, we got to ask the question, are we built tough? The gospel builds tough people. It does. It doesn't work, man. But I think what happens is that at times we tend to kind of be saved, and I've seen this, and even those of us who've been saved for a minute, we tend to kind of get saved, and then we highlight the change that we've experienced in ways that reflect our happiness. We even connect it to changing circumstances, like Jesus saved me, and now everything has changed. Like what do you mean by that, right? Like, yeah, lots of things change, meaning we're going to begin to be conformed into the image of His Son, and we're going to be sanctified, and we're going to be made holy, and so there will be changes, but it doesn't usually look like our circumstances change. In fact, in some ways, our circumstances get harder because the promises of Scripture, the promises of the New Testament are that through many tribulations will God's people enter into the kingdom of heaven. But we tend to Disneyfy our salvation, especially early on. And I lived happily ever after. It's like, wait a minute, that wasn't why Jesus saved you. Jesus didn't save you for your happiness, for your health, wealth, and happiness. He didn't save you for your prosperity, all right? That is a lie from the pit of hell, all right? If we're ascribing to that or listening to somebody talk about that or say that that's biblical, that is not. That is not why we've been saved. We've been saved to be delivered from the domain of darkness. We've been saved for the purpose of being released from the kingdom of hell, from our sin, from the wrath of God, His rightful wrath. We've been saved from all that and brought into this relationship where we have this defender, this rock, this protection, no matter what may come our way. And Paul understood this, and he understood it well. So from the jump, Paul knew that he would suffer because he was told in chapter 9, verse 16, by Jesus Himself that he would suffer. And that's what is happening, and that is what will continue to happen. He recalls even returning to Jerusalem soon after his conversion, where Jesus warned him to leave because believers didn't trust him, so he had to leave Jerusalem. And again, it's because he had been a persecutor. So again, he just keeps bringing it back, like, I rejected God. Remember that? Like, I did that. And up to this point, the crowd, they tolerated it. But then came the moment that broke them, in verse 21. He's quoting Jesus again, that Jesus said this to him, "Go, for I will send you far away to the Gentiles." The Jews didn't like this. They wanted this to be about them. They did not like the fact that this was going to be extended to the Gentiles. They did not like Gentiles, all right? Just like the Gentiles didn't like them. So what happens? The mob erupts in verse 22. "Away with such a fellow from the earth. He should not be allowed to live." And then they get really dramatic here. They disrobe, and then they fling dust in the air. There's so much outrage in this moment. Outrage over what? Outrage over what their holy book predicted. Outrage over truth, right? Blind outrage in many ways. This is what this is. This reminds me of the current moment. We're no different 2,000 years later. There's blind outrage. In fact, we're outraged over things that are corresponding with what's evil, instead of being against evil. In our culture is like being outraged against truth and what's right and what's good and what's holy. So much blind outrage. So what happens as we get ready to close here? The Roman tribune in verse 24, he seeks clarity, and this is what he does to seek clarity. He orders Paul to be flogged. This is a really strange interrogation technique, by the way. All right? And as Paul was stretched out for the whips, Luke tells us, he asks again. He raises his voice. He has enough wherewithal. Imagine what Paul has already been through, what he's about to go through. And he stops and he speaks. Is it lawful? So he appeals to Roman law, because remember, he's a Roman citizen. Is it lawful to flog an uncondemned Roman citizen? So, of course, he and this tribune have this whole interaction where the tribune gets to the bottom of the fact that Paul is more of a Roman citizen than he is, because this tribune had to purchase his. Paul was a Roman citizen by birth. So the flogging ceases in verse 29. But the tribune still has questions, and this kind of leads us into where we'll be next week. So the next day, we're told by Luke, the tribune gathers together the chief priests and all the council to meet with Paul. So again, we're left with another cliffhanger here in verse 30, and we'll pick it up next week. Paul is going to continue his defense, but mostly he will continue to defend his God, even if it costs him his life, which eventually it will. He was ready for whatever pressure came his way because he kept his eye on the prize. He kept his eye on the objective, on the aim. I was reminded of this really funny instance that happened decades ago now. But, being from Southern California, I was into the whole punk rock scene. And so I was at a punk rock show. And I was there with one of my big friends. I've told you guys about how big my friends were in high school and college. But I was there with 6'8" Sage, all right? And my man Sage had a hat on this day. But he took it upon himself to go dominate the mosh pit. All right? He just said, I'm the biggest guy in the room. And he just gave us that look like, guys, you'll be okay if you want to come with me. We were like, no, we're just going to sit back and watch this unfold today. So he went into that mosh pit, and everybody around him, they saw red. They looked at this big 6'8" guy, and they said, let's all conspire, and let's take out the big guy that's got the hat on. So every few songs, man, things would get crazy, and Sage was just throwing bodies, but every once in a while, his hat would fall on the ground. And when he would lean over to pick it up, it's like everybody knew, this is our time. Let's jump on him. So we would see all these bodies just jump on Sage. And it didn't matter to him. He was going to make sure that he got out of that mosh pit with that hat on. And so it happened multiple times, and all these bodies are coming on. But it didn't matter. Sage didn't care. He's throwing bodies off him. Bodies are just flying everywhere. And he picks up that hat, and every time he'd raise it up in the sky and look at us and point triumphantly. The priority, the prize. This is us, guys. This is the gospel. This is God's glory. May we fight for it, like Sage did with that hat in that mosh pit so many years ago. There's nothing worth fighting for more than God's glory. I know, I get it. We're fighting for our own glory. We're fighting for success. We've got these measurables in our mind. We're setting goals. Listen, you're not promised tomorrow. Set some goals, but be present today and live out these goals to the glory of God and to the good of others. We've got these selfish aims and these weird desires, and it's kind of all related around like this Western idea of success and climbing ladders and just making it and having everything set up well. And I think in some ways there's a lot of healthy aspects to this, but we put all of our stock in this. And we lose sight of why we're even doing the things that we're doing. We're doing all these things to the glory of God. Like, yeah, go ahead and try to make more money to the glory of God, so that you can expand His kingdom and set up your children's children well, all right? Like, do it. Build relationships. But don't build relationships just for the sake of building relationships because you feel lonely. Build relationships knowing that you won't feel lonely if you build relationships, but that so you'll be able to bless the lives of other people. This is how this works. God's glory, others' good. It simplifies everything. Let's fight for that. What are you fighting for today? All right? Because again, we've got no defense at the end of the day. At the end of the day, I fight for my glory. So I needed God to do what He did, to become our literal defense. This is the gospel. Though He had the greatest defense, He hung on a criminal's cross, becoming our defender. That's what He did. That is the good news. He is our defender. May we cling to that. And may we honor Him in that as we go about our days.